Hey, this is Off the Cuff, and I'm Steve from TorahFamily.org. So, today we're talking about Hanukkah, Purim, and the end times. Now, please keep in mind, there are multiple views on the calendar as to when Hanukkah and Purim will fall on the Gregorian calendar. So, just because some may say one of these have already happened, well, it may not have on another calendar. To know more about the calendar that we follow, you can see these two teachings, the calendar and calendar confusion. Let it be known that neither Hanukkah or Purim are commanded festivals of Yahweh. They're not mentioned in Leviticus 23. However, celebrating historical events are not forbidden either. Now, that being said, we need to use caution in the traditions that are often used to remember these events. I once had someone tell me that people who celebrate these are actually adding to the Torah. But that's just not true. Only when someone says we have to follow these celebrations are they actually adding to the Torah. Torah is the instructions of Yahweh, and one is adding to the Torah if they say these are now commanded by Yahweh for us to observe. That's adding to the Torah. But celebrating a historical victory or event, by choice is not adding to the Torah. So I hope that makes sense. Now, before we go to the prophetic element of this teaching, there needs to be a foundation set regarding Hanukkah and the issues some people have regarding it. Since we just talked about adding to the Torah, the historian Josephus claims that the Jews did just that regarding Hanukkah. He said they made a law to celebrate Hanukkah. While keeping this quote from Josephus up, I have to tell you that there is no record of Judas Maccabeus or any of the Jews at that time making a law for Hanukkah to be observed. Neither 1st or 2nd Maccabees records anything of the like. I need to say that while I believe we can learn from Josephus, at the same time, I have concern with anyone who retells history from their own perspective. If we asked 10 people today who are respectable in the public's eye to write the history of America, what do you think we would get? Well, it would all depend on the background and upbringing and the surrounding influences these people have had in their life as to what their view would be given on American history. So, let's get a glimpse of the background and perspective that Josephus was brought up under. From what we can tell, he was born to an elite family in Jerusalem while under Roman rule in 37 AD. That's several years after Yeshua's death. His father, Matthias, was a priest. Now, let's pause here for a moment. At the time of John the Baptist's birth, we know John's father was a priest. This means John was in line to be a priest. So, why wasn't John a priest? Most likely because the priesthood was overthrown. This is where we see the Pharisees, Sadducees, and teachers of the law come into the picture. Thus, the men who wanted Yeshua killed were men holding position they didn't belong in. Their positions were most likely granted to them from Rome. Thus, their words in John chapter 11. They were concerned about losing their position. So why was this a concern for them? Well, most likely because their position was indeed granted from Rome to begin with, and not naturally given through the true order John's dad, Zechariah, was in. And for what it's worth, I highly doubt any high priest would have torn his garment if they heard Yeshua declare he was the Son of God at the trial that they held against him. Why? Because a true high priest would know the command regarding those clothes. To me, it just shows they held little respect for the position, but more regard for the stature it brought them. So, this sheds some light on the priesthood Josephus was born under in 37 AD. Some may want to say here that there were some priests and Pharisees who believed in Yeshua, and I agree. However, if they were going to continue in their faith in Yeshua, they would have been forced out of their positions. Now, that being said, we do see some Pharisees who later believed in Acts 15. If you're interested in what happened in Acts 15, please see our teaching titled The Acts 15 Dilemma. However, it is highly doubtful these Pharisees held any position with the temple leadership that was governed by Rome. And there is no way any priest would have maintained their position if they chose to believe in Yeshua. And that is what Josephus' dad was, a priest. What is more concerning is what that priesthood at the time of Yeshua's death said about themselves and their children. In Matthew 27, we see the priests and the elders amongst the crowd persuading them to have Yeshua executed. Then they joined the crowd in answering Pilate to crucify Yeshua. Then, after Pilate washes his hands of any guilt, they all said, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." Less than 10 years later, we have the birth of Flavius Josephus, whose dad was most likely in that very same crowd saying, "Let his blood be on us and on our children." At the very least, he would have been in the ranks for that order. Now, Josephus, by the way, later fully defected to Rome and was granted Roman citizenship. He later became an advisor and friend to Titus, serving as his translator when Titus led the siege of Jerusalem. Now, that siege failed at stopping the Jewish revolt. However, Jerusalem's destruction and the destruction of the temple came not long after. So, is this the person we want to give 100% trust in accurately rewriting Jewish history? Since his influences, that surrounded him were the Pharisees and the teachers of the law who made the people follow their added laws. It's not surprising that Josephus claims an added law for Hanukkah. I say all of this because, again, nowhere do we see the Jews at the time of Judas Maccabeus as making or observing a law for Hanukkah in either books of the Maccabees, first or second. Yet, that's what Josephus said. However, we simply see where they requested their fellow Jews to observe it. That's a big difference from requiring it through law. Hanukkah remembers the dedication of the temple that came about because of a military victory. Hanukkah simply means to dedicate, as we see here in Deuteronomy chapter 20. Hanukkah is a part of history, and as we will see later in this teaching, it will be a part of prophecy just the same. Not all the traditions that surround it, of course, but the timing for sure. As noted, Hanukkah is not a commanded feast of Yahweh. The commanded holy days of Yahweh are found in Leviticus 23. Hanukkah is the time the temple was rededicated as a result of a military conquest. The story of oil lasting 8 days is not found in the Hanukkah event of 1 Maccabees. Neither is it referenced in 2 Maccabees. There is nothing to show this ever happened. Let me say that again. There is nothing to show this ever happened. Hanukkah, as noted in 2 Maccabees, was a celebration of a delayed Sukkot, that being tabernacles. That's why it lasts 8 days. But why would they celebrate it as such? Well, most likely because it was at Sukkot when Solomon dedicated the first temple. So chances are they wanted to dedicate the temple in like manner. So it became a traditional second Sukkot in the 9th month. In fact, that's what they called it. While we remember Hanukkah, our family no longer celebrates it like many others do. After digging into it, we found several things we simply felt that we simply needed to set it aside. Namely, that being the Hanukkah. We didn't find it anywhere in the Hanukkah story. However, we did find it in other religions. Plus, the middle candle of the Hanukkah is called the Shamash. It's referred to as the servant candle. Yet, Shamash is not Hebrew for servant. Shamash was the sun god of the Mesopotamian religion. Interestingly enough, the Hebrew word for sun is strikingly similar. It's Shemesh. So, while people won't celebrate Christmas because of all the pagan traditions that surround it regarding sun worship, lighting the Hanukkah could be doing the same thing. This all being said, no one really knows exactly when the Hanukkah was brought into the celebrations of remembering the dedication. Again, the Hanukkah is never referenced in the first or second book of Maccabees. There are many who like to give gifts at Hanukkah. However, there is nothing to show they gave gifts to anyone at this dedication, or any of the times they remembered it thereafter. Many say Yeshua celebrated Hanukkah. While that can be debated with many, and we'll cover that in a moment, we don't see him openly condemning the dedication either. John chapter 5 verse 1 mentions the feast. It was most likely Shavuot, also known as Pentecost. John chapter 7 mentions Sukkot, which is also known as Tabernacles. Then, many believe chapter 8 is the timing of Hanukkah, because this is where Yeshua says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will never walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." Many believe his statement here was made in a condescending way towards those who were celebrating Hanukkah, a feast that by that time became nicknamed as the Feast of Lights. A name, by the way, that was also used for the pagan holiday Saturnalia. While the timing of Yeshua's words here seems it could fit the narrative and timing, there's nothing to prove this verse in chapter 8 is actually referencing Hanukkah. Now, that being said, the mere fact that Hanukkah became referenced as the same nickname of Saturnalia should cause everyone to use caution with any added traditions given to it as well. Then we have many who refer to John chapter 10 as being the celebration of Hanukkah. Because there is such a debate out there about this verse being Hanukkah or not, let's take a few moments and dig into the surrounding text to look at the pros and cons of this view. While I see this as a possibility, there are other dedications John 10 may be referring to. Now, I'm not saying John 10 is not referring to Hanukkah. I'm just saying we need to use caution in saying it is. While Hanukkah can fall after the winter solstice, it's not guaranteed to do so every time. Many like to point out how the Greek doesn't say Feast of Dedication. It only says dedication. And that's correct. Yet, it's because of this that many say this verse can't be referring to Hanukkah, but rather a specific day of dedication, and not a feast of dedication. While we're open to this, we can't forget that 2 Maccabees refers to Hanukkah as a purification. they themselves didn't always reference it as a feast. So, just because it's not referenced as a feast in John 10, we must remember it wasn't always referenced as a feast before that either. However, going on the assumption that John 10:22 isn't talking about Hanukkah, what dedication could it be talking about is the question. There are other dedications John 10 could be referencing. The dedication of the altar with Moses in Numbers chapter 7 happened in the spring, so it seems that one wouldn't apply. The dedication for the temple at the time of Ezra and Nehemiah was in the month of Adar, according to Ezra chapter 5. So, this one is plausible. The dedication of the wall in Nehemiah chapter 12 gives us no specific time frame. Solomon's dedication of the first temple took place at the time of Sukkot, according to 2 Chronicles. That's the fall, not winter. So, biblically speaking, it would appear that the dedication found in Ezra would be the only match that John 10 could also be referring to. One problem I see with believing this dedication in John 10 to be that dedication mentioned in Ezra is that there is no evidence showing it was celebrated on an annual basis. The scriptures never record it was supposed to be, or that it ever was. The only other dedication that may have been celebrated annually would be the dedication that Herod did. Herod held his dedication in the month of Adar, just as Ezra did. The 12th day of that month was supposedly the dedication of Herod's renovations on the temple. It matches the winter time, that's for sure. However, we're not sure if it was celebrated annually after that. When reading the narrative of John, it could appear that chapters 10 and 11 flow together as a storyline with no time gaps in the midst. Why is this important? Well, some would say because it shows it's right before the time of Passover. In short, the remaining verses of John chapter 10 shows Yeshua escaping the Jews from stoning him and going to the other side of the Jordan. Then, chapter 11 gives the full account of Lazarus being raised to life. People reported to the Pharisees what Yeshua did, and they proceeded to devise his death. Then we see verse 55 say how the Passover was near. This is where many will try to say why the dedication being celebrated in chapter 10, the previous chapter, had to take place in the 12th month, the month of Adar, taking place right before Passover, which happens in the first month. This would make that storyline take place within 4 to 6 weeks. Now, while that may be very plausible and something I believe we all need to be open to, 2 verses give reason to question that interpretation of that timing. First, it would be the verse just before verse 55, that being verse 54. There is no time allocated here. He could have withdrawn to this region for a few weeks or a few months. So the dedication mentioned in chapter 10 could have still been the dedication of Hanukkah that ends in the 10th month, just as easily as it being one that happened in the 12th month. Plus, we have the opening verse in chapter 11 that creates a question of timing as well. While one could easily read it into the timeline of the previous verse, we have to admit that it could just be bringing up an event that came later. It could have been days later. It could have been weeks later. It could have been months later. We really don't know. The mere fact that we see Shavuot, Sukkot, and Passover all referenced within chapters 5 through 11 should make us pause on reading it all as though it's a seamless storyline. All I'm saying with this is that we need to use caution in using John 10:22 as a definite defense for Hanukkah. Now, while it may be the dedication of the Maccabees being referenced here, there is reason to question it just the same. This doesn't mean the rededication of the Maccabees can't be remembered. I'm just saying John 10:22 may not be a solid defense for that remembrance. Now, all that being said, something that I have found very interesting. While there is no record of oil lasting 8 days at this time, like I mentioned earlier, there is a recording of a miracle taking place with oil in 2 Maccabees just the same. I encourage you to read 2 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 19 through 36 to get the full story. In short, we see oil that was laid on a sacrifice ignite the moment the sun broke through the clouds and shone down upon it. Again, the full story is found in 2 Maccabees chapter 1, verses 19 through 36. I don't know why this miracle is never referenced to in the traditions of Hanukkah. I just don't get that. However, I believe it is one worth noting and one worth bringing into the remembrance of this event. I can only say that it will be for our family from here on out. However, there is something else I found of great interest in reading the conquests of Judas Maccabeus. I found it interesting how the time of Purim is mentioned, and not in a small way. The ironic thing is that it was a victory over a man who completely hated the Jews. I'm talking just like we read in the story of Esther. 1 Maccabees chapter 7, verse 26 shows how the man hated the Jews. I encourage you to read 1 Maccabees chapter 7 to see what happened. But as you see here in verses 43, 48, and 49, this great victory happened on the 13th day of Adar. Just like the miracle of the oil, I feel this is a huge story that gets overlooked regarding the storyline of Judas Maccabeus, especially in the light of how the timing matches Purim, and the scenarios are strikingly similar. Sadly, this was the last victory for Judas Maccabeus. But why? Well, I have a theory. I'm not saying the theory is right. However, I think it's one that could be and probably should be at least considered. After we read this victory on Purim, the following chapter tells us how Judas was hearing of all the conquests of the Roman Empire. Long story short, Judas made a peace treaty with Rome. We then see the death of Judas in his next battle, found in the following chapter. His peace treaty with Rome could have been what paved the way for Rome to have the position they held over Israel during the time of Yeshua over 160 years later. Now, in all of this, I think it's interesting how we see the time of Purim referenced as one of the victories with the Hanukkah story regarding Judas Maccabeus. However, there is something I find even more interesting. This is where we start seeing the possible prophetic significance with these historical celebrations. We know Hanukkah is referenced in 2 Maccabees chapter 2, verse 16. Yet, just before that, we see where Jeremiah the prophet is referenced as to when he hid the items of the temple, and how the time of them all coming back out would be at the time when Yahweh gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. Then, in the same context, 8 verses later, we see them celebrating the dedication, Hanukkah. In seeing this reference of Jeremiah in 2 Maccabees, along with the celebrations of Hanukkah, one can't help but wonder if there is any prophetic significance to it. I say that because regardless of one's view, if we should commemorate the purification of the temple as recorded in 1st and 2nd Maccabees, no one can deny that this time has prophetic significance given what Haggai chapter 2 says. The prophet Haggai makes it clear this time is something of significance with prophecy. It says, "From this day on, I will bless you." So, could this be what Revelation chapter 20 is referencing about the blessed resurrection? The day when we will truly be blessed? The following day is Hanukkah. When we continue reading, we see more given regarding what is said on that day. It mentions a shaking of the heavens and the earth. An interesting thing is, we see a shaking of the heavens and earth mentioned elsewhere. Actually, at the beginning of this very same chapter. Verse 6 specifically. However, verse 1 tells us what day it was on. This word came to Haggai on the 7th day of Sukkot, the 21st day of the 7th month. Interesting, isn't it? The shaking of the heavens and the earth first mentioned to Haggai at Sukkot, actually just before Sukkot is over. And then it's mentioned to him again just before Hanukkah, the second Sukkot, the celebrating of the dedication of the temple. Could this be giving us some kind of like bookends, if you will, to the timing of everything is going to happen? Things starting around a Hanukkah and then ending at the time of a Sukkot? Well, I don't know. If you have watched any of my teachings on prophecy, you know that we believe we need to be considering all possibilities and not be stuck to only one view of something being right. While we will all lean to a particular perspective, and that's okay, that's fine, it would still be wise if we keep ourselves open to other considerations. Now, that being said, how would Hanukkah and Purim play a role in the end times? Will there be a 7-day warning given to his people as Noah had? And remember, that's the time when he first shook the heavens and the earth. If so, what would that warning look like? Now, just as much as I can see a 7-day warning like Noah had, we can't forget what the 10 virgins had in the parable of the 10 virgins. The call they received came on the same day of the event. No 7-day warning. It happened on the same day. But they had something that woke them up just the same. Both the foolish and the wise woke up from that call. What type of event would happen that would wake all of Yahweh's people up? Something that would confirm to them all the days that we are living in. Could it be that which was spoken regarding the words of Jeremiah? The revealing of the tent, the ark, and the altar of incense, as Jeremiah said? Jeremiah said it will be when he gathers his people together. The time when Yeshua gathers his bride? The time when he brings the two sticks together? This verse here could actually imply these items of the temple are revealed on the day he gathers his people, meaning on the day of the resurrection. So these may not be revealed beforehand as a warning or a sign, but rather as a result of him gathering his people. The earthquake at that time of the resurrection could be what reveals these items Jeremiah hid. So just as much as a 7-day warning is possible, it could all happen in one day just the same, meaning the warning and the resurrection takes place in one day, just as mentioned with the 10 virgins. And please don't forget, while many say we should be watching Israel, I personally believe it will be what Israel does and not what is done to them that we should be watching for. Now, why do I say that? Because many say, and I agree, that the total and final destruction of Damascus will be first from what we see in Isaiah 17. However, it appears this final destruction spoken of is a direct result from what Israel does to Damascus. Could this event be the warning given to us like the 10 virgins received? Then, that same day, the resurrection takes place? For what it's worth, if this final destruction spoken of truly is from the hands of Israel, this could be the reason why all the nations surround Israel later on. But the point is, the final destruction of Damascus from Israel could be the wake-up call for the 10 virgins. That parable alone seems to imply there will be something that wakes us all up just before the resurrection. Now, for those who believe we can't know the day of Yeshua's return, please see our written teaching titled, Knowing the Day. And for those who do not believe Yeshua will take his bride before the tribulation, please see our written teaching titled, Pre-Trib. But this all being said, could there be a 7-day warning? Something that happens and then 7 days later we see the resurrection. Could the 24th day of the 9th month be when Yahweh reveals something to us all, to wake all the virgins up, if you will, thus giving us a 7-day warning like he did with Noah, and taking us to the last day of Hanukkah, that being when he comes for his bride and shakes the heavens and the earth through the earthquake of Isaiah 24? I don't know. But what if it's the last day of Hanukkah when something happens to wake all the virgins up? Well, many might say, well, then where would the 7-day warning be? Well, it's actually there just the same. You see, we can't forget the 10th day of the 10th month, 10:10. To understand the significance of this day, please see our teaching, Watching for That Day. In that teaching, we discuss the 4 fasts that are turned into Moedim. One of those fasts is the 10th day of the 10th month. Honestly, I never saw how that specific day fit anywhere. But now, with it only being 8 days after Hanukkah, well, I can kind of see something possibly panning out there. What if something would happen on the last day of Hanukkah? We then would have 7 full days before the 10th day of the 10th month. Well, I don't know, something to consider anyway. There's so many options and possibilities. Something I do believe is possible, though, is that the earthquake of Isaiah 24 being an event that lasts over several days. So, could it be that he takes his bride on the last day of Hanukkah, the day when the earthquake takes place? Then, after the dust settles, that's when he takes his bride down to Mount Sinai to establish the new covenant on the 10th day of the 10th month? Now, I know some would be quick to say how the 10th day of the 10th month, it's for the Jews, and that being Judah. Okay, that's the day for them to rejoice. But don't forget that Yeshua is from the tribe of Judah. What better day to rejoice than when he marries his bride? And we know that when one rejoices, we all rejoice. Something I find interesting with this is a parallel that we find in the book of Esther, a book that I believe is of prophetic significance, in my opinion anyway. It's there we see Esther was made the bride of the king in the 10th month. Could the 10th month be when Yeshua takes his bride and begins his 1 year to be with her before going off to war, per Deuteronomy 24? Or maybe it's the 10th day of the 10th month when the 10 virgins are all awakened. And Hanukkah is simply, well, I don't know, like a reminder for us all that we should be purifying ourselves. There are just so many thoughts for us to consider here. Things that we all need, I believe, to at least be open to and considering when these days cycle around every calendar year. However, when looking into all of this, I ran across something that I really want to share with you. In the past, I've discussed the element of the Sabbath in Matthew 24:20. Now, the words in the brackets here are actually not in the Greek. I've often pondered this verse before because it just doesn't add up for me. For a long time, I wondered if it could be discussing a Sabbath year, actually. And I suppose that's still possible. I'm not throwing that out. But the way it's presented here, it's as if someone can't flee for their life on the Sabbath. But that's not true. Nothing in the law forbids one from fleeing for their life on a Sabbath, if it's a Sabbath year or a Sabbath day. There have been lots of destruction happening on a high holy day and Sabbath days. Plus, we know they marched around Jericho on a Sabbath at least around one time for sure. So, what are we missing with Matthew 24, verse 20? That being said, I'm starting to think this verse is the equivalent in meaning to Luke's account in chapter 21. You see, everything we have discussed here so far has taken us through the end of the 9th month and into the 10th month. This leads us into the 11th month. The 11th month is called Shabbat. So, could Yeshua have said Shabbat with the intention of meaning the month? But all these years we have understood it to mean the weekly Sabbath, Shabbat. Plus, the month of Shabbat is in winter, so it would make more sense if he is actually referring to the month. With not having the original manuscripts, it's difficult to say, but it fits, and something I believe we need to think and pray about. Now, this all being said, the meaning of the name of the 11th month itself carries the markings of judgment. Thus, pray your flight is not in the month of Shabbat. So the resurrection and judgment on Babylon, which happens almost simultaneously, takes place before the 11th month, most likely even before the 10th day of the 10th month. Please see our written teaching titled Pre-Trib to see how the resurrection and the judgment on Babylon happen together. According to Revelation 17, it's Yahweh who puts the motive to judge Babylon into the hearts of the other nations. Then, just as one gloats and then rests from their accomplishments, by the 24th day of the 11th month, we see the nations at ease from what they did. However, we see they took the judgment too far in verse 15 here. And why do they feel secure? Because Babylon, who oppressed them, is now gone. They defeated it. In this same text, we see that judgment is coming on Jerusalem next. In fact, here is a word for word of the Hebrew for verse 12. Yahweh of hosts, until when you no mercy on Jerusalem and cities Judah, which angry this 70 years. Meaning, he has been giving them mercy for 70 years, but that mercy is about to end. So just after the resurrection and destruction of Babylon, we see judgment getting ready to come on Jerusalem. Thus, the armies that will be surrounding Jerusalem, most likely in the 11th month, the month of Shabbat. So the people would start fleeing, taking their flight, if you will, to the mountains in that month. Now, please see our teachings, Satan's Greatest Masquerade, Part 1 and Part 2, for more detail on where they specifically go to in the mountains. Then the Assyrian invades. Please see our teaching titled The Assyrian for that. All this leading up to Judah rising back up at Purim. And just as Judas Maccabeus conquered on Purim, could Judah, meaning the Jews, defeat the Assyrian on that same day, most likely being led by the anti-Messiah, thus paving the way for them to make him their ruler just 30 days later, around the time of Passover and unleavened bread? Exactly how it will all play out, nobody really knows. Time will tell, that's for sure. But one more thing I find interesting is how the month of Shabbat could actually be the start of the 1,335 days that's mentioned in Daniel chapter 12. If the 1,260 begins around Passover, and then 30 days before that could be the start of the 1,290 days just after the victory on Purim, possibly having the victory on the 13th day of the 12th month, with the sacrifices restarting again on the 15th. That would put the 1,290 on the 15th day of that month, 30 days before Passover. Well, that puts the 1335 starting on the first day of the month of Shabbat, 45 days earlier. Thus, Yeshua's words, pray that your flight will not take place in the winter or on Shabbat. The month of Shabbat. Now, I'm not saying I have this all worked out, and I'm not convinced things will work out this way, meaning the 1335 actually starting on the first day of the month of Shabbat. Now, it might, of course, but I'm not convinced of it. I mean, well, the 1,260 could start at the end of unleavened bread and not at the beginning of it. Or it could actually start like one day after unleavened bread. And that would put everything back 7 or 8 days. But that could still work out. He's probably saying, well, how? Because the victory could still be taking place at the time of Purim. It would only push the sacrifices back 8 days, and possibly them doing so would actually allow them that 8 days of official purification, if you will, to set the sacrifices back up. So it fits. So again, the 1,260 could start 8 days after, meaning at the end or even after that of unleavened bread. And then the sacrifices would start 8 days after Purim. Again, giving them time to do a official, cleaning, if you will, the purification, like Hanukkah, lasting 8 days. The same thing, purifying everything out. It's possible, I suppose. Then the 1,335 would still be starting in the month of Shabbat. And for what it's worth, I currently lean to the thought that the 1335 will simply be when the people start fleeing because they see the nations surrounding Israel. I think this will be when the nations begin prepping for the war on Purim. Now, Zechariah chapter 1, verse 7 and 11 shows this war will definitely not be until after the 24th day of the month of Shabbat. That seems pretty evident, but they could still be prepping for it just the same. Thus, the people fleeing. These are simply things we should put to prayer as we watch and pray for his return. and we should be watching and praying for his return. Exactly how and when the days all work together is yet to be seen. I'm just wanting to give you some things to ponder on. Well, that's all I have. Think about it. Pray about it. But more than anything, be a doer of the word and not a hearer only. Until next time, Shalom.